Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Catholics, non-Catholics, pagans, Buddhists, whoever may be watching. Welcome to the Catholic Demonology and Spiritual Warfare podcast, the first edition of this podcast. Today, I wanted to cover a topic that I recently saw in the news, specifically a woman from Kentucky was recently arrested and charged with trying to hire a hitman to kill her husband, which in itself is not totally unusual. This type of thing does happen. There are many cases of people getting arrested, for trying or attempting to hire some kind of a hitman to kill somebody. Usually it's a spouse, um, and so, and by the way, you know, usually when this happens, the people, how they get caught is they'll ask a family member or friend, hey, do you know anybody, do you know a hitman? And they end up getting introduced to usually an undercover cop who poses as the hitman, and that's how they are eventually arrested, which obviously stupid criminals. But as far as hitmen go, hitmen are absolutely real. Not like you see in the movies, there's not, a bunch of John Wicks running around, knowing every martial art known to man and, being able to, fend off 100 attackers and whatever else is portrayed in the movies. But real hitmen do really exist, and there are professional hitmen out there that work for different criminal organizations, the mafia, drug cartels, other types of criminal organizations. And these are people who you would probably never recognize in society. They would just look like normal people, but in reality, they are professional killers. And a lot of these people are usually ex-cops. Some of them, had worked for the mob or stuff like that. A good example would be a guy named Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman. He worked for the mafia back in the 70s and 80s. He eventually was caught, and when he was caught, it was estimated that he killed possibly over 100 people. Perfect example of that concept. Professional hitman, cold as ice, just ice in his veins, complete psychopath, probably possessed, probably perfectly possessed. Actually, there's a priest that I know of. I can't say his name on here because he's not publicly known as an exorcist. But he's an older priest, and he works out on the East Coast. He's a professor at a major university, Catholic university on the East Coast, and he's an exorcist and has been for a very long time. And he's probably one of the leading priests in the whole country in, the exorcism ministry, but he's not publicly known as an exorcist. So I can't say his name. I'll just call him Father M. And several years ago at the Mundelein conference, so every year there's a conference at Mundelein Seminary. It's a conference on healing, deliverance, and exorcism, where all the experts of that field in this country get together for a conference every year. That's been going on, boy, since 2005, I think. Um, and only priests can attend the conference. Lay people, the only way lay people can attend is if they are actively working on an exorcism or deliverance team, or if they get direct permission from their bishop. So at this conference back in, I believe it was 2009, this priest that I was just talking about, Father M, told a story about a hitman that he met. when he was working in New York at the time, I believe it was. Um, and this hitman had come to see him, and they were meeting together. And Father M said this guy was, dressed like a businessman, impeccable suit, completely normal looking guy. You'd never guess, but he was a professional killer. Black bag job, he called them. And so this hitman went to go meet with Father, and I know that Father M invited him to go to confession with him, and the hitman was like, "Well, I can't do that. If I tell you anything, I'd be killed. There is no working. This is how Father M explained it. There is no working for the mafia or a drug cartel and killing people professionally for them and then just retiring, to Florida with, retiring to Florida with, Gladys and I are going to retire to Florida now. There is none of that. That it's impossible. So once you're in on something like that, there is no getting out. Um, and that's with several other things too, forms of the occult, Satanism, devil worship, specific types of cults. But so this hitman said, "Yeah, I can't do it. Can't confess to you because if I tell you anything, I'll be killed. They'll kill me." And Father M was like, "Well, does anybody even know that you're here?" And he said, "No, absolutely not." And so Father M said, "Well, who's to know if you just confess, to me right here?" And the hitman, looked at him and said, "Well, there's another reason I can't confess to you." And Father M was like, "Well, why? Why not?" And the hitman was like, "Well, isn't it part of Catholic, confession that you have to be contrite and sorry for your sins and that you won't do it again?" And Father M was like, "Well, yeah, that is part of it, of course. That's part of Catholic confession. You have to be sorry for your sins, number one, and you have to, promise that you're not going to continue to do that. That's part of the act of contrition." And so the hitman said, "Well, I can't do that. I can't, say that." And Father M was like, "What are you talking about?" And the hitman said, I can't say that I'm sorry, for this because I like what I do." And I remember when Father M said that, all the people at the conference, their jaws just dropped. Like, whoa. And there was like this, din in the audience, and everyone was like, "Whoa." So this guy couldn't confess because he liked what he did. He liked killing people. He got off on it, and that there is people like that out there. And for the typical Catholic out there, that might be very hard to believe. But the fact is that there are people out there like that. And Father M had told this story in the context of um, a type of possession called perfect possession, which is when a person is completely and totally possessed by a devil or the devil, and there's no longer any signs of the possession because their will perfectly identifies with the will of the devil. And I'll get more into that in a different video, but suffice to say that I did write a book about that topic, which is coming out soon on July 9th, actually. The title of that book is called Slaves of Satan, a Catholic Study of Perfect Possession, Diabolical Subjugation, and the Enemies of Jesus Christ by Patrick Bell. So that book is coming out in the summer. It's the first book ever written about that whole topic. So hitmen. So this woman who was recently arrested for attempting to hire a hitman to kill her, I believe it was her ex-husband, who had just recently gotten custody of their two children. And I think that she had asked a colleague at work if she knew anybody, that would do that. Yeah, let's go ask a colleague at work. "Hey, you know any hitmen?" And come on. And the colleague at work was very concerned, and she told the FBI, and of course the FBI got an agent to go undercover and pose as a hitman. And she was eventually arrested. She's in jail awaiting trial, and I assume she's going to get a lengthy prison sentence for that. So that's not the part of the story that is extraordinary, and the part that I want to talk about. The part of this story that's extraordinary is the fact that before she, asked her colleague at work if she knew any hitmen, before she got arrested, before she did all that, she actually attempted to enlist the services of a some kind of occult practitioner to put a death spell or curse on her ex-husband. So in article, the article specifically states that she tried to enlist the help of a Brazilian spiritual healer. Now, Brazilian spiritual healer. That could be many different forms. There's many different forms of Brazilian occultism. Several different forms of it, actually. So this woman, the spiritual healer, um, really in that tradition would not be called a spiritual healer. So there's four, especially if she was willing to put a curse, on somebody to kill them. Um, and most likely this woman, the spiritual healer that the woman tried to enlist the help of was not a real healer. Most likely she was some kind of a fraud. Because she asked for money and she required payment up front and several other things that tell me that most likely she was just nothing but a fraud. But in that world, there are actually four different types of, um, Brazilian Brazilian occultism. And by the way, the name of the woman is Stephanie Russell, and this is what she looks like right here. So that is Stephanie Russell, and she is a doctor, no less, a pediatrician, believe it or not. So imagine that you're bringing your kids, to see their pediatrician, and in her side time, she's doing black magic rituals to kill her ex-husband and trying to hire undercover FBI agents as hitmen. Nice, huh? So, in as far as the practices of that type of Brazilian they're called Afro-Brazilian practices, really, and there's actually like three of them. So they all used to fall under a heading called Macumba. So Macumba, there's like several different things that would fall under Macumba and what used to be called Macumba, which would be basically Umbanda, Candomblé, Quimbanda, basically. So those used to fall under the heading, called Macumba. Now, Macumba, the people who practice Umbanda and Candomblé, they would not say that the things that they practice is Macumba, because Macumba has more of a black magic, left hand path connotation. The people who practice Candomblé and Umbanda, consider themselves practitioners of, I would say, what they would call white magic. Now, as a Catholic, based on what we believe, it is very clear that there is no delineation between white and black magic. All magic is bad. All magic is evil. All magic is demonic. It only works through demonic agency and intervention. So, but as far as what they believe, they would say that they do not practice Macumba. So the other one, that would be considered a black magic type of practice would be Quimbanda. So, and actually, this doctor, actually, when she got a hold of this Brazilian healer, she asked the Brazilian healer or practitioner if she practiced Quimbanda, which Quimbanda is, that would be considered like the black magic part of those types of religions. So, and I think that the healer messaged her back and said it's a death spell, honey, or something like that. I don't know, but most likely this woman was a fraud, the healer at least, because she required payment up front, and she also guaranteed, she said that her rituals have an like a 85% chance of success, which is just total crap. I mean, all that stuff depends on so many different factors. A money. She said that there was a money back guarantee if her death spell, didn't work. Which is just complete crockery, obviously. So, but that actually goes into one of the factors, as far as curses and spells and all that stuff go. Um, so people who know anything about, spiritual warfare and demonology and possession and exorcism know that curses, and another word for curse would be a hex, a vex, it could be called a vex, a hex, curse, whatever. Um, if you know anything about this stuff, you know that those are real things. So it is possible to put a hex on somebody. Other people have given the example of hiring a hitman to kill somebody, which is perfect for this talk. So it would be very similar to that, hiring a spiritual person to do something or doing it yourself through, because it's only all this stuff work, magic, witchcraft, occultism, all that stuff. The only reason any of that would ever work at all is because of demonic intervention and agency. So there's no natural forces or elemental spirits or spirit guides or any of that crap that would make the occult work. It is only done by intervention of diabolical spirits specifically. So that is why all those things are a grave sin against the first commandment, a grave sin of superstition, and they are absolutely and totally condemned, by the church completely. So that is basically where that comes down. So the factors involved. So this woman, Dr. Stephanie Russell, tried to hire this Brazilian spiritual practitioner, who again was probably herself a practitioner of Quimbanda, or Macumba, probably not Umbanda or Candomblé, because again, the people who practice those things, believe that they're doing white magic or good, which again, they're really not. But regardless, so the practitioner was probably involved in Quindomblé, Quimbanda, and was gonna try to do a curse or whatever. But again, I think she was just a fraud. And so, but as far as curses and hexes go, there are like there's several factors, probably like 5 or 6 factors, that would determine whether or not a curse or a hex um, would actually be affected. So there's one primary factor, the big factor, and then there's like 5 secondary factors, or what I would call secondary factors, right? The big number one factor, obviously, is the permissive will of God. So demonic spirits are usually on a very short leash. They operate via a very specific set of rules and regulations that have been laid down by God, and they cannot exceed the bounds of what God has ordained. So they operate, they certainly cannot do whatever they want. If they could, we would all, I think it was St. Augustine who said that if the devil could do whatever he wanted, that we'd all be dead. Either that or we'd all be enslaved or something like that. So they certainly cannot do whatever they want. And because of that, the in order for a curse or a hex to even work, God would have to allow that to happen. So why would he allow that? Well, that kind of merges into the question of why does he allow any evil at all, which is a mystery. But usually what I've found is that because it's the reason he does allow it is to bring the greater good out of it. In some way, he brings good out of all those things, even though it may not seem like it at the time. Who are we to question his will? So that's the first factor, is the permissive will of God. Second factor, um, and I'm going to kind of do these in order of importance. I would say the second factor would be whether or not the person who is the target of the curse or hex or vex is in a state of grace or not. And secondarily to that, whether they are active participants in their faith. What is their prayer like life? Do they frequent the sacraments? Do they, pray the rosary? Do they use sacramentals? Do they use holy water in their house? Blessed candles, blessed salt, blessed oil. So are they in a state of grace or not? So usually, now there's exceptions to everything. In the spirit world, the other thing I found is the spirit world is not, it's not just black and white, this or that. So it would not be accurate to say that being in a state of grace protects you 100% completely in all cases from a curse or a hex. That would not be accurate to say. Usually it does. If you're in a state of grace, then those things will have, if somebody tried to curse you or put a hex on you or anything like that, usually that would have no effect if you're in a state of grace. And especially if you're in a state of grace and you frequent the sacraments, have a intense prayer life, use sacramentals. If you do all those things, then curses or hexes probably likely won't have any effect on you because you're protected by God and his holy angels and the saints. So the secondary factor would be, I would say it would be like it would be the person who is actually doing the curse or hex. So as I said earlier, this Brazilian spiritual healer likely was a fraud, but that is not to say that they are all frauds. They are not. There are people who are involved in the occult who are like the hitmen I was talking about earlier, who are professionals. They know what they're doing. They've been practicing this stuff for years. Oftentimes, it was in their family. It could be multi-generational, and so the specific practitioner of this type of activity, and again, even that can vary. In this case, it was Brazilian, Quimbanda. It could be Santeria, Haitian voodoo, Palo Mayombe. It could be Satanism, witchcraft, black magic, ritual magic, any number of things. So it depends on that as well. So is the person a fraud or are they a professional? Do they know ritual? Do they know why rituals work? Do they know the elements of ritual? Do they know how to do black magic? So that is a big factor because obviously somebody who's a fraud, what they do is not going to have any effect. But if it's a professional practitioner of some specific occult science, there is a much higher chance that if they do a curse or hex or whatever, that it would have an effect. And again, all curses, all hexes, all that stuff are only brought about through demonic intervention. So the demon is actually the one carrying out, the spell or hex, or rather the curse or hex. A spell is something different. Is like the actual a spell would be like the actual ritual or words of whatever curse they're doing. So another secondary factor, I already Yeah, I already talked about the specific type of magic involved. So is it witchcraft? Is it black magic? Is it sorcery? You know, is it Santeria? Whatever. So um, there are some exorcists who say that some of those forms of occultism are more dangerous than others, and I would say I kind of agree with that. Um, somebody who is practicing modern day Wicca is certainly not going to be as dangerous as somebody practicing multi generational witchcraft. So those are two totally different things, completely different things. And somebody practicing multi generational witchcraft, or which is sometimes been called multi generational fertility cults, somebody practicing that stuff is going to be far more dangerous individual than somebody practicing modern day Wicca. So, so there you have that. Another factor would be the type of evil spirit involved in this. So specific types of occultism, invokes different kinds of spirits. So all these different forms of occultism, they worship different types of spirits. They give honor to different types of diabolic spirits. They enlist the help of different types of diabolic spirits. So the diabolic spirits that are, say invoked in ritualistic Satanism are totally different than the ones invoked in witchcraft. Those are two completely different hierarchies of, spirits, different names, different everything. So in some cases, there might be some crossover there, and the same spirit might have multiple names. That could be true as well, but usually they are different. So um, another factor about whether a curse or hex would work would be whether or not an object was used. So sometimes when objects are used, it could have more of an effect, especially if a person were to swallow an object, which would be called a it can be called a concoction, whatever, where a witch or a sorcerer concocts, something usually made out of bodily fluids, um, semen, blood, urine, feces, stuff like that, and they concoct that into something, and the victim of the curse swallows it. In those cases, those can be more dangerous than just a spoken curse. Although I will say that spoken curses, and by the way, even those there's different kinds of. So we could talk about this all day. There's so many different kinds of curses, maledictions, maledicts, malefices, hexes, spells, occultism. The lists are endless, right? But just speaking about curses, so there is different kinds of curses. There would be like a ritual curse where if you're wanting to put a curse on somebody, you go through a whole elaborate ritual. Sometimes it involves an animal sacrifice. In the case of Quimbanda, in that specific case, it would involve an animal sacrifice usually. um, so there's a whole ritual involved with some curses. Other curses are just spoken, and are not done through any kind of ritual or occultism at all. Some are just, you get mad at somebody and say, GDU. That's a curse. That's a curse. In fact, some of the worst cases of possession in the Catholic record were brought about through curses like that, through informal curses. The 1928 Erling, Iowa case, one of the worst cases of possession in the literature. That case was brought about because a father cursed his own daughter. And by the way, in those cases, the curses would be much more effective, much more evil if a parent curses their own child. In those cases, those are very bad, can be very destructive. So in that case that I just referred to, a father cursed the devil into his own daughter because he was wanting to commit incest with her. And after he cursed her, she became possessed. And she became possessed by some of the highest devils in hell. And it was a bad case of possession. Some of the, most extraordinary preternatural phenomena you can imagine, happen in that case. So very bad. Sorry about that. Um, where was I? Different types of curses. Yeah. So if the curse involves some type of object, those can be worse, especially if they swallow something like that. So also another factor, and this is probably the last one. I think I've gone over pretty much all of them. Um, the last one would be which kind of ties into the practitioner and um, whether or not they are a professional. What would tie into that is excuse me, the specific type of relationship that practitioner has with the evil spirits. So there's different types of relationships with evil spirits. There's different types of possession, and there is definitely different types of relationships that people have with evil spirits that can be much more destructive. Much more destructive. I referenced that earlier in this podcast when I talked about perfect possession. So when a person has given their whole entire being over to the devil, those cases are much more dangerous than other cases. So, um, what else? So, I guess Quimbanda, the specific type of Afro-Brazilian occultism that this doctor tried to have the practitioner, do to put a curse on her ex-husband. Um, that specific type of occultism, there's so many different areas but the basics is they worship or call upon these spirits called exus, right? And these spirits are, I believe they look at them as like ancestral spirits, or even different types of like, say, manifestations of nature, like lightning or thunder, or stuff like that. Um, so as far as that goes, they if they're going to do a spell or a hex, they would most likely call upon one of those. So though also the exus are considered the male spirits, and actually there's a couple different kinds too. There's what are they called? What the heck are they called? Pambagira, yeah, Pambagiras. So Pambagiras are the female type of spirit, and usually those they say are like the spirits of dead women, prostitutes specifically. And so it would be probably on one of those spirits that a practitioner of Quimbanda, who are called Quimbanderos, um, that they would call upon one of those to issue some type of curse or a spell. And also, most likely, if it was a death curse, they would probably do a animal sacrifice along with it, which could be a chicken, a goat, a pigeon, sometimes even a bull they could do, depending on the circumstances and all that, surrounding it. So, and obviously, if an animal sacrifice is done, it might have more of a negative effect, depending again on the specific person doing it. So, and curses, like I said, I just went over all the different factors about why they work and why they don't work, the primary factor, the secondary factors, but they can work. And that, again, one of the primary secondary factors is the specific person doing it. Are they a professional? Are they a fraud? A great example would be in the life of Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was one of the most infamous. I wouldn't call him a Satanist. He was a ritual black magician, is what he was. He was involved in many different types of secret magical societies, and he, was involved with the demonic for his whole entire life. He practiced very, very advanced forms of ritual black magic. Um, I don't think he called himself a Satanist, though. If anything, he was a sorcerer rather than a Satanist. So, a good example is when he was on his deathbed, and by the way, he was a heroin addict. Aleister Crowley was. When he was on his deathbed, he had been being given morphine by a doctor at that time, and actually, he had been selling the morphine to children around the neighborhood where he was, and the doctor that was giving him the morphine found out about that. And when Aleister Crowley was on his deathbed, he was racked with pain, and he asked the doctor to give him more morphine, and the doctor refused to give him more morphine because of the fact that he had been selling it. Aleister Crowley went ahead and cursed his doctor, and that doctor actually died very shortly thereafter. So that's a good example of somebody who was involved in the occult for their whole entire lives. He was a absolutely consummate professional in all of the aspects of ritual black magic. He knew what he was doing, knew about rituals, why they work, knew about demons, he knew about all that stuff. He was an expert in it. And so when he issued a curse to his doctor for refusing to give him more morphine when he was on his deathbed, that doctor did indeed die. So they can be dangerous, they can be effective. Although, as a Catholic, you certainly should not be going around every day thinking that somebody put a curse on you, especially if you start having some bad things go wrong in your life, everyday things. Don't start attributing, oh my gosh, somebody cursed me. This is a big problem, especially in Italy, where people are constantly coming to exorcists and priests thinking that somebody put a curse or a hex on them, when in reality it's just regular life things that go on. So as far as that goes, so as a Catholic, you should be solid in your faith, have a solid prayer life, have a solid sacramental life, frequent the sacraments, keep yourself in a state of grace, frequent the sacrament of confession and the Eucharist, pray the rosary in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and use sacramentals in your home. And if you do all those things, 99% of the time you are going to be protected from anything like a curse or a hex, or anything like that. So if there's, one thing I would take that you can take away from this podcast, it's that. It's to do those things. Lastly, a curse from a Catholic perspective, a curse is basically a specific type of what's called a malefice. Um, now, malefice, basically comes from two Latin words, which means, to do evil. Um, so, what was I gonna say? So there are a couple different types. Three. There's three different types of malefices. There are, and by the way, all of the types of malefices are complete inversions of Catholic things, which is a higher principle at work, that which is called the principle of inversion. So anytime the demonic is involved, there's going to be some type of inversion of the good. That's why they will, in a say infested house, that's why you'll find crucifixes have been turned upside down, or even pictures of saints have been turned upside down, stuff like that. That's why the upside down cross is one of the primary symbols of atheistic Satanism, because it's the principle of inversion. So in the specific case of malefices, there are three kinds: deeds or works, words, So, by the way, deeds or works would be an inversion of the Catholic principle of good works. Okay, words um, or invocations, which could take the form of a a spell and invocation. Um, the inversion of that, what that's inverting is a blessing. So basically, when a priest gives you a blessing, the inversion of that is somebody, putting a curse on you, which could come in the form of a spoken word. And the third type of malefice would be objects, or sometimes those are called. I'm having a brain lapse here. Sometimes those are called fortunes. Fortunas, yeah, Fortunas. That's what they're called. So, and those have, many different forms. All of those which are inversions too. So those can be statues, figurines. A voodoo doll is a good example. Could be strings, feathers, pieces of yarn, pieces of metal fashioned into different things. Stuff like that. So, and curses and spells, curses and hexes can use, can take the form of all three of those things actually. So one example of a specific type of curse that I know about would be, that was actually done to somebody a long time ago. Um, a cow was killed, ritually killed, sacrificed, to a specific pagan god. I'm not going to say which. And the tongue of this cow was cut out, tied tied to a string, and hung from a tree. Okay, and the specific type of magic involved there, basically, I think that would be called imitative magic, or that would be considered an indirect work rather than a direct work. So I know I'm using a lot of phrases that are might be complicating for some people, but a direct work would be if you actually like put a curse or spell um, like over somebody and they're there in person, like by touching them or using a piece of their hair or something like that. An example of that was given in the movie Rosemary's Baby, when the main guy who was the witch put a curse on the woman's male friend who tried to warn her that these people were witches. The guy got a hold of, I think it was a piece of hair of his, and used that to put a curse or a spell on him, and the guy died shortly after. Now, that's just a movie, but that's an example of what that could be. An indirect work would be something that is done when the person would not be there. So, what I was just talking about with this cow, where its tongue was cut out and it was hung by a tree. So that would be an indirect work, right? And they did a very elaborate type of ritual and spell, basically stating that as the tongue of the cow was, rotting away, or what's the word, that I'm looking for, deteriorating, as that tongue was deteriorating, so then the body of the person who was the subject of the curse would start deteriorating too. And in this case, it worked. The person died, but that was because that was a specific type of very powerful occultism and magic. The person who was a target of it didn't have any faith or protection either. So um, I have to be kind of careful a little bit with some of the things I say because I don't want to give too much information and cause somebody to try to do one of these things, which would be horrible. This is a Catholic podcast at the end of the day, but um, being forewarned is to be, forearmed. Knowledge, is power, and the more knowledge as Catholics that we have of these things, I think the better. Although not everybody, should have. There's only specific people, that should have the really deep knowledge of this stuff, which is mostly exorcists, people who study demonology, who are specifically working for the church in some capacity. People who are trying to help people that need this knowledge in order to use it to help people. So the typical Catholic, everyday, man or woman in the pews does not need to know all this stuff. So, but regardless, I just thought that would be a good place to start this podcast. The Dr. Stephanie Russell. So just arrested, trying to kill her husband. And before she got arrested, she was attempting to do some kind of death spell on her husband, which obviously in that case it didn't work. So yeah, but it should be a warning to everyone, and I'll end it on that. I will end on a warning to anybody even considering getting involved in anything like that, whether it's Brazilian occultism, whether it's whatever, Wicca, any kind of occultism, or, divination, witchcraft, Wicca, which I know is very popular nowadays. I want to end on a warning to that. Do not get involved in that stuff, please. You're playing with fire. Most likely, you're going to open a door to some type of demon. You're going to get attacked. It might come into your life in some way that you don't even know it, and it's going to lead you down a path of absolute destruction. And before you know it, it might be too late. And all of a sudden, you're dying and you're being judged and you're going to hell because you chose to get involved in the occult. So just don't. Practice your faith, pray, frequent the sacraments, pray to God. He created you, He loves you more than anything you can imagine, and keep it at that. So, if you want excitement in your life and you think the occult is like this lure of excitement, then practice your faith and start praying, because let me tell you, the Catholic faith is full of excitement. Your everyday life as a Catholic is a battle between good and evil. Literally, it is. I know it's sometimes it's easy to forget that, because of just the grind of everyday life, but it really is. Everything you do, everything you do has an effect on the world around you, okay? And that effect can be either for good or for evil. So spend your days doing good and loving other people, and, spreading the kingdom of God. So the Catholic faith is the best faith to practice because it's the church that was founded by Jesus Christ and the apostles 2,000 years ago. Obviously, Christ is our Savior. He is God. Um, and the just the everyday battle between good and evil, even in yourself, the temptations that you get, all of that stuff is a battle, and all of that stuff affects people around you and the world around you. And the more good you do, the better. And you will, as the scripture says, lay up treasure for yourself in heaven. So I'm going to leave it at that. And until next time, this was the Catholic Demonology and Spiritual Warfare Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got a lot of knowledge. And I'll see you next time. Thank you. God bless you.